So what are you speaking about today?
I'm going to be telling the beginning of the Leela of She Is Mind.
Okay.
And I need to do this in the context of the direct relationship to Adida,
Okay.
Siddhaguru Adida, my bright beloved master, heart master. So as I've been considering this with a number of devotees in terms of how to make this offering, it was recommended that I do this first,
Right.
this particular Leela first,
Mm.
that comes from my diary during the time of being at the Mountain of Attention with Adida. There's a lot to this Leela
Okay.
that could take quite a long time to tell because there's so many nuances to it that are not about me personally in and of itself, but relates directly to my participation, those who are intimate with me in this process, and those who are working with Adida in making his image art. So I'll just begin reading from my diary and then adding a little bit of context to it also.
And when are these diary entries in relationship to the whole? Were these taken at the beginning of She Is Mine or the end or middle?
No, so I'm going to begin with an actual entry in my diary from February 4th, 1999. And this is the year of the brightness event that initiated the divine translation phase of his seventh stage demonstration, Adida's outshining brightness and the culminating revelation of his work that puts everything that he has ever done within the context of the great tradition into reality truth, the bright conscious self domain that clarifies everything that he has done and clarifies the great tradition as a whole. So this is what I wrote in my diary, and I was surprised to find this because, of course, I don't remember a lot of what I have written or even a lot of the details of what have transpired in the context of our life and relationship over all the decades. And also just to make the point that my telling of my part of it is just a small part of it. And of course, Adida himself has spoken about it, and as many others have, and there were many participants in this process with me, um, and directly with beloveds. So this is just my small offering as a portion of it. And the reason I'm doing this is because I was the model that was used,
The soul model.
the sole model that was used for this particular suite called She Is Mine.
Mm.
So this is February 4th, 1999. This is me speaking. This is the year it will all happen. So it is time to keep the diary as I, in quotes, see it and experience it and am given it. Fundamentally, beloved, has asked that all I, in quotes, be surrendered to allow him to use me as he must to accomplish his work this year. He said, this is the year it will happen. The only reason it would not happen is if we, meaning devotees as a collective, could not make it right around him. And then he says the only rightness is divine recognition. He said his purpose is divine rightening. It is the time now, and so it is. And every day is an ecstatic torment of tapas, a real burning off of patterns at the root core bonding, in quotes, level of mere attachment by virtue of familiarity and love. This is the big test. I am utterly having to fall, to let go, to open. The circumstances, in quotes, hurt, but only if I forget the who that is the room itself and its nature as love, bliss, consciousness. Liberation, please. Now I'll go on to reading the next portion of this diary, a diary entry, and this moves us forward into 2002. Okay, and this is in March of 2002, and I'm already at the Mountain of Attention Sanctuary. And I'm sitting at Beloved's feet here, and I'm making a communication to him as an offering of recognition about the nature of what I just described in terms of what occurred at the Brightness event that initiated his divine translation, and then also speaking to him about the recognition of him at Lopez when he was speaking to us from above and beyond. And I was communicating to him the recognition of his condition in his outshining brightness and understanding the nature of the way in which he was brought down and is brought down in the context of the devotional process and relationship to him and in the devotee. And I was confessing to him the reception of him in the samadhi of the thumbs and all of the gifts that he had given me throughout all the years that were indications of his unique process of allowing his bright intervention to actually take form and to manifest true devotees in a true culture of true renunciates. So this is a recounting of an occasion during this time of being called over to be the model. I didn't know exactly what was going to happen, but he wanted to make use of me. And so I ended up going over there, and this began the She is Sweet. Excuse me, She is Mine Suite that became a suite. And so here is a confession of what occurred one day. As I was serving Beloved in his bedroom in the Manor of Flowers, which is his home on the Mountain of Attention Sanctuary, he had just woken up and was sitting in his seat in one corner of his room, whereby he could view the Japanese gardens outside the window of his room. Often upon waking, he would sit there and receive devotees, gifts of devotion, and hear communications regarding the world state of affairs, all inclusive, from devotees to the weather and everything in between. He was served his breakfast too, and this sitting would at times last for hours. This process of offering gifts and communications to him and his communications to us, and instruction and the reception of his darshan, which was always the context of whatever we were doing with him. On these mornings, there would always be sacred chanting occurring, or beautiful live or recorded music from all sorts of traditions that would be playing in the background, and there would be the sweet smell of incense that devotees made for him that you would constantly be participating in as it wafted through his room. And then there would be the sounds of the waters, from the Japanese garden, and then also of the waters that were running in his bath in his house. And sometimes these particular occasions would occur with just one devotee, but more often than not, there were many devotees that were present and that were coming in and out of his room for various practical and sacred purposes. And this context occurred through decades of his working. But unfortunately, as time went by, it was more often that just one devotee ended up being there. And I want to explain the why of this. Ultimately unfathomable to explain, but again, this is my observation and confession, and based upon his communications to me and his communications to other, and his personal confession about his work. So while he was in the context of communicating to us in this manner, which was just one manner of the many means that he gave to be able to feel him and feel his instruction and his transmission. In these times of the communications process, which is what we ended up coining it, he ended up just speaking with smaller and smaller numbers, and often it ended up being just one person or two people and a tape recorder and a notebook and a pen towards the end of his life. And this was mainly because he wasn't pleased. And I'll put that in quotes because what that means is that when he was brought into this situation to communicate and receive communications or to exchange gifts, he ended up reflecting to us that even after everything that he had already accomplished and all of what devotees had given of themselves and in the form of gifts over the years to help him establish his work, he was still reflecting to us that there were no true gifts, and I'll capitalize the word true, or mission, and that there were no true devotees that were the principally required gift for him to work with. Now I'll explain more about that as I can continue to communicate here. So what was offered, he did not want to have a lot of people to be engaged in this process with him because it was a disturbance. He didn't like to be in a context where he was being viewed as being disturbed because he was sensitive to how this impacted devotees, particularly because he was aware of the sacrifices that had been made and how many devotees had stayed and continued to serve in the world and assumed different ways of serving him, from on his body all the way out to anywhere across the globe, or even those who were serving him who were not even necessarily physically incarnate, including animals and rooms and spaces and things and beings of all kinds. But he was having to reflect that still it wasn't sufficient. What we had given him wasn't sufficient. So these occasions oftentimes became very loudly spoken, which many devotees are aware of.
Well, he was also another was gracious in that he would not have that many people around. It was so intense that not many people could handle it.
Yeah, that's right. What you're saying is that he was gracious. That's exactly right. Because of the intensity of it, not many people were able to conduct that intensity. And yet, as he has said over and over again, that he can't compromise. He wouldn't be serving his function if he said, okay, this is sufficient when it really wasn't, in terms of our coming to him for most perfect liberation in reality truth, in his unique manifestation of the bright. So when he was not pleased, he was saying that he wasn't being truly set apart by true devotees or gifts. And this was being signed by the fact that there wasn't actually real growth in any aspects of his work. So his words were often filled with a combination of both fire and water, passionately spoken from his heart of being. So he would, because the numbers had subsided in terms of these particular occasions, he was very insistent, even more so than he had been previously, that every word be recorded in terms of what he communicated, and also that it be written down, and all of this be put in the archives to be preserved, and none of it to be destroyed. And he did this because he didn't really trust that his word would be correctly written down or correctly communicated by the devotee or devotees, whoever that one person, or whoever they were, that were taking the notes, that it wouldn't necessarily be communicated properly. For example, my own handwriting had become a kind of shorthand that was literally illegible to anyone else because I would have to write so quickly that I was the only one that was able to read it, when I would have to say go off and then record what he said by just having taken handwritten notes. So he was very emphatic that it actually get recorded by his own voice. And also Adida wanted the communications to be saved in perpetuity. so that it would be available to all future generations, so that there would be no confusion about what he actually communicated, even though much of what he communicated sometimes would not go into the literature that was published, that would be accessible to everyone publicly. Yet these communications, he indicated that they should be made use of culturally. Yeah, they were commonly referred to as notes, and they would be culturally communicated so that people could understand the context within which his actual literary art forms or his visual art forms or his darshan was being given, so that we could understand his process as he lived it and communicated to us. It was always about the demonstration of his incarnation and his Leela that he accomplished. So the notes that I offer below were of such a nature, the details of which were a direct response to my confession to him that was directly about his work with myself and others that are involved in the image art process in satsang and as a sangha. So it wasn't just about me, it was always about whatever he was working with that was being communicated to whoever was coinciding with him directly on out. Not as though it was the center as a space and place or a local place. It wasn't reduced to that, but it was his direct communication to everyone and everything. And now this was a very common occurrence that would happen daily and all day long. And this was much of how his teaching words and all of the forms of his treasures came into being, by these conjunctions and coincidings with thousands of devotees over the decades of his work. And then there were some that he would be described as ones that he would call his intimates or his gurukula, or the ones that he said he could work with most directly, unbeknownst to us and without justification and incomprehensibly so. There were some of us who spent very significant time in his intimate sphere and in his house. So as I was confessing to him, recognition of him in relationship to the work that he had been doing, specifically from the brightness event and from the translation time that occurred at Lopez, I was confessing to him how it was very clear to me that what he was doing with me in his photographic work and making use of me as a model, which I understood to be just a vessel, I was just a puja article, literally, not as if I was abstracted or somehow it was, I wasn't there. I was fully there, presently, whole bodily present, down to my toes, and feelingly receiving him and participating with him. And I was communicating to him how this tied into the recognition of him when I saw him and felt him and participated him while he was working with me in making of the image art. And I was also confessing to him that I recognized that the work was integral to what was happening in the room as he made those images, and as those who were in the room with him and with me and in the set and with the technicians that were involved, and then outside that in the ashram and then extending on out into the world, and literally in a feeling, intuition and actual feeling, perception and awareness of his work with the cosmic domain, not just merely the psychophysical one that we can view and perceive and conceive. So as he was acknowledging and receiving my confession, I could feel that this was a true gift to him. And the way that I would read this, and many people can speak to you about this, is that he would show the signs of a lover receiving the reception of a loved one. So I was speaking to my beloved, and he was responding to me as his beloved, but not as separate others or exclusively. And his toes would wiggle, and he would be saying cha in the ways that we understand that's his pleasure response, and his skin would become very soft and his pores would be open and become translucent and bright. And it was literally a love embrace, just as you would feel uniquely with a lover that you don't often see in a social setting, say, or in an ordinary exchange. It was a unique context of intimacy, divine intimacy. So what occurs in this divine intimacy is there's a magnification of his bright swoon. So you would be, the being the ego self is forgotten, and you are awake and aware of the swoon of bright being. And this becomes pervasive in the space and the place, and all conditions are viewed in this context and become obvious, and as everything is inclusive in the infinite fullness of his bright room. And this is also then made obvious through and the way that the samadhi of the thumbs is manifest, and the being is actually fallen into his condition and is opened up inside out through his descent, and then you are then rested priorly in the consciousness domain in his person. And in that, the literal awareness and awakeness in the heart cries out in ecstasy, saying, no place else to go, no place else to be. This is the beingness, this is the being, the space of being. And you are wedded there in that love bliss yoga, and it's absolutely self-sufficient, completely satisfying. And the seeking is no longer active. So this was what was occurred in this exchange with him. And then he asked me to put the tape recorder on and to take notes. And so in this, you're functional still. You're always required then to function in response, to be a servant in the midst of this exchange and this embrace. So I picked up the notepad and picked up the pen and turned on the tape recorder. Now, I'm going to tell you something unusual here, and I'm doing this for a very specific reason, because it points to something really important to understand about the way that he worked and the dynamic that occurred around him. And it carries a criticism, okay, which is not meant to be hurtful. It's actually liberating if you understand what I'm going to be pointing out here. So just as he began to speak to me, and it wasn't just to me, when he begins to speak here, then we know that this communication is for all. And I began writing, and I knew that the recording had begun to happen. And as soon as this occurred, suddenly another devotee swooped into his room, in the bedroom, and didn't have to go very far, because the corner within which he was sitting was just right at a doorway that was an entry to his bedroom that was actually his dressing room. And off that, there was a room that went out to a outside patio, and another room that went into a darshan hall. So this was the temple space, and his bedroom was right off of this area. This devotee swooped into the room, took the pen out of my hand, and began to take the notes herself. So as this happened, I need to note here that beloved Adida looked at me directly as this happened, right into my eyes. And he raised his eyebrows. And I knew and felt that when he did this, he was waiting to see what my response would be to this devotee's seemingly gross intrusion. My response was, what the heck? And I lifted my eyebrows and lifted my shoulders up and put my hands out, in a kind of a mudra of disbelief, I guess you could call it, with my palms up and my hands splayed out and my shoulders raised up. And I was expressing, like, why is this happening? And then in the midst of that, I made the choice to simply yield. I didn't make anything of it because I didn't want to create a drama. And I actually, honestly, didn't care if I took the notes. And the reason why is because when you take the notes in that setting, what's required afterwards is that you have to leave the room. You need to go out from his body seat, to go out to record the notes or communicate the notes, pass them on, give instructions, and extend them on out. And although at times that was an ecstatic thing to be able to do that, really, it was extraordinary to bring these things and these gifts out to beloved's devotees. But for me personally, I actually didn't want to leave his feet. I didn't want to leave his body seat. That was where my service mainly existed, was to serve his body, to serve his room, to serve his house, to serve his gurukula, to serve his children. I did have some cultural responsibilities that extended out in order to accomplish those things, but I really didn't like doing the communications process that much. So here we are, and I have to confess that I was bothered by it. And I was also made curious by this action because he, Adida himself, wasn't intervening in this moment to point out what to me felt to be rather rude. um, Now, the reason why this is important to mention is because it explicitly elucidates the vivid change that occurred after the Lopez and his divine translation event. And it describes the way that he was trying to communicate to us that he could no longer submit to intervene or to relate to us in the way that he had prior to the Lopez event, in a similar manner that he did from the day that he began working. And as he spoke, there were various events and periods of time throughout his teaching work that he would always indicate that there was a change in him and his process and his confession of the seventh way demonstration and the phases of that. And inevitably, then that would require a change on the part of the devotees in the ways that we would serve him and the ways that we would relate to him. At least we were meant to be keeping up with him in that regard. So the fact that he didn't intervene in that moment in the ways that I had previously known him to do, which would be, he would address both of us directly in that moment, both the person who was seemingly being rude, I'm saying seemingly, and also my seeming reaction of what the heck is this about, and why aren't you intervening, and this doesn't seem right, quote unquote, to me. There was this that was going on in the room in the midst of this profound communication that he wanted to make about the nature of his being. So this is an example of his final, quote unquote, demonstration of non-submitted capability and manner. And he would describe this as a disentanglement in his outshining work that was a sign of his divine translation, in which he would no longer intervene in what was our business to handle. In other words, we had to handle this business between one another so that we would not interfere with his work in his divine outshining, culminating phase of divine translation. Now, I think I've previously spoken about how this is not linear. You know, the way that we think of his demonstration is not linear in time and space. I won't go into that right now. But he said that when this was occurring for him, that what would constantly interfere with his ability to do his work was that the intimate guru bhais and the gathering as a whole were not handling our business with one another. And therefore, it was not making it possible for him to continue to establish the group of renunciates around him that he needed in order to be able to continue his work in the body. Because he wasn't going to reflect to us or correct us anymore, because he had already done it thoroughly. He'd addressed everyone and everything about all the aspects of what we needed to do in the process of preparedness and establishing the foundation for him to be able to work with us in spiritually transcendental terms, based upon true listening, hearing, and seeing, and then the perfect practice. So this is an example of him still being in the room, us being in the room with him, all the way down to the ground, but simultaneously bright above, humanly manifested and sacredly integral with everyone and everything. Now, the reason I wanted to point this specific incident out is because it's also tied in with the Is Mind Leela and the suite that I will communicate more about. So now I'm going to presently read to you the words that I wrote in my diary from this very moment in time. And these are the notes that I took when I heard the communications that this devotee who ended up finishing the recording process and the communications process in that moment. But I took these notes because they weren't only a broad communication, they were also in response to my confession to him. So I wanted to record that in my own diary. So when I listened to this recording later, this is what I wrote down. Now, I want to make mention that all devotees engaged in this diary process as a discipline, where we would daily write in our diaries, or however often we could, we would record significant moments in his work and in our relationship to him as confessions either of Narcissus' self-understanding, reception of his darshan, but important coincidings, just the significance of the relationship and the Leela altogether. And in confessing these signs of response and reception of him, then he's also showing us how to serve him in this radical understanding of this moment in time in his work. And so in this communication to me, he was also serving my ability to be able to simply stand or sit in the context of his image art making process, and enabling me to be related to him as he is, and to make use of the gifts that he had already given me in order to be able to be made use of in this manner with him. Now, the notes that I'm going to read to you are not verbatim, but these communications do exist in the archives, and they were tape recorded. And obviously, these bright words from him are also communicated in many different ways throughout his written and spoken words, not just at the end of his lifetime during this particular time from early 2000 until 2008, but this communication is the core process of his bright confession from the very beginning of his work. Okay? So this is important to understand. So I will then begin reading the communications that he gave to me at that time. Bright Dalavananda. I did not become me at the Vedanta temple. I did not become me by virtue of any experiential process. I was as I am at birth, always established in the avataric divine person at birth. I am the revelation. I am the realization. The process itself is this relationship to me. The divine is self-revealed as me. The realization and the revelation. And this takes place only through a transmission process of recognizing me as not other. I am self-transmitting this revelation in the present. I am the language of reality itself. This is the yoga. This is the divine spiritual process. I am the truth of the subject and object in this seventh stage way. This is the seventh stage realization. See me, serve me, protect me in the body. I have enjoyed the acts of self-revelation from birth. I should have been recognized at birth. This occurred through the conscious consent to descend. This was my submission into darkness. And it became possible because of the thumbs. The bright is the reality of my person. So examine the psychophysical structures of this descent of the thumbs and the bright. Sadhana is devotional surrender to this. This is the ultimate perfect practice. The books are secondary to this recognition of me. And this devotion to me is primary. You, as ego I, live in desperate darkness until you come to this relationship and realization of me. Recognition is what failed to happen. Because the direct relationship to me is the way. And there must be a cultural manifestation of full responsiveness to this. Satsang is devotional service, and you set me apart by this recognition. I do not represent anything. I am me. Me. Real devotion is required based on this recognition. Divine self-realization is me, my samadhi. The culture is the conforming of this. The mission is to speak of this recognition. And to speak of me, you must transcend egoity and mind. The thumbs is my submission. The thumbs is the process from above and beyond, combined with the psychophysical structure of the true devotee. But this is only effective through devotional self-submission. When I say that I exist above and beyond the brows, what I mean is that I am in a state that no longer makes the submission. There is constant udvareta. This is an Indian Hindu term, Sanskrit. This means that this is him speaking again, there is no energy below the brows. I am not of the mind that creates energy in the body. He's speaking about his body. I am beyond the gross and subtle and cosmic domain. This is the basis of my bodily human form, and it is most profound. I radiate into the body from above, but when I say that I do not come Down below the brows, this is a description of a yogic association with gross life. There is descent to the brain core to animate the body-mind, but attention is not descended below. And this changes my interaction with people. Therefore, the relationship is a yogic one and a divine one, and that is all. I am not dissociated, though. It is a wounded matter, spiritually so. Any way that I am required to function in the physical domain means that it has to be right spiritually. This is the Santoshi time. So you can no longer require me to endure this exchange of suffering people. I do not enter into anything casually in the gross domain. This is the reality of true celibacy also. Spiritual celibacy is a matter of udvareta, and it must be based on the outgrowing of mind and the gross persona. And this requires profound, true celibacy. It is freedom from the descended mind and the gross persona. Therefore, the sexual process has nothing to do in and of itself with realization. This realization that I speak of is a natural process. This way is about me and not the ego. Therefore, the divine process is what determines life's realities, and that's with a small r. Purification and conserving in the circle of egoic patterns is therefore necessary. This celibate disposition will reveal itself in the depth of the process. With my descent, emotional sexual bondage becomes purified, and the context of practice will therefore become clarified. To be aware merely in and as the psychophysical being is dark, yet I reveal the bright as the reality context in the midst of this darkness. This relationship is spiritual, not as an experience, but it is about spiritual awareness. To be in my company is to be blessed with this spiritual awareness. It is always darshan. Today is the beginning of divine life. Oh, Ma Da.